All right. Hello, everyone out there, all our Psi enthusiasts. We are back with another episode of Psi Games Talks, where we're talking to, me and my co-host Tyler Stevens are talking to today Dale Graff. Dale Graff is going to be one of our speakers at the Psi Games this year. We'll be covering so much stuff when it comes down to the Psi phenomenon and how these things manifest in these different abilities and how to use those and grow those abilities. And we really had to have Dale on our show today because, you know, he's one of the OGs, right? So, you know, he's one of the guys that has been around for a while doing this. Actually, we have a weird connection where he got an opportunity, or at some point he linked up with my ninja teacher, this guy named Stephen K. Hayes, and they worked on a project for a short period of time, or at least he tapped in or saw some of my teacher's abilities, or had him do like a remote viewing. And so we'll talk about that. We'll talk about Dale's journey, which has been a very amazing one. His time in the remote viewing program with the military, you know, first starting his own kind of thing that he was doing investigations at Wright Pat Air Force Base, and then moving on to actually at one point even being in charge of the program for a couple years. So without further ado, he's already been here and you guys have seen him. Let's welcome Dale Graff here with us today. Hey, Dale, how are you?
Hey, great, wonderful. Okay, yeah. I'm ready to roll. I'm ready to go.
All right.
History. Go ahead.
Yeah, so let's start with it. So let's go back some years. How many years now? Maybe 40 or 50 years when you were when you were working on your project at Wright Pat Air Force Base. How did you get started there? How did that end up referencing with remote viewing, or, you know, crossing over into remote viewing? Tell me what that story is about. What was that? What started that whole thing?
Well, yeah, it's a question about how did I end up doing what I was doing at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in the 1970s. You know, I often wondered, how did I really get there? And even why, you know, why me? But I have to go back years. We're talking about a phenomenon, and the term, you know, most recently that we're using for this, remote viewing. Of course, there are other terms that have existed and still exist that attempt to define this ability, this ability that we all share at a deep consciousness level, at subconscious or collective unconscious level. Now, I didn't understand any of this as a child. But I had dreams as a child. It was very easy for me to recall dreams when I was quite young. And some of them were weird in a way, having to do with incidents that would happen the next day or two that I couldn't have guessed. Now, I didn't have the words for it. I didn't have the idea of precognitive dreaming. Nobody wanted to talk about dreams to me as a kid, so I never really brought it up much. And some of those dreams were actually what I call lucid. Later on, I learned the term lucidity from some of my colleagues in the dream community. And as I studied this, you know, when in the 20s, I got into this a little more deeper. I didn't have these dreams when I went to school or college. I majored in engineering, and it wasn't aeronautical engineering. There wasn't a lot of time to mess around with stuff like that. But eventually, my interest returned. I learned that some of the experiences I had as a child, I could have labeled as lucid dreaming. So that got me continued that interest in this world of dreams. And I met people that could do things in the conscious state. They just had different words for it, you know. It's clairvoyance or telepathy, and they had these experiences that they couldn't explain otherwise. Knowing something that was unknown or concealed from them. So I eventually, when I left the aerospace industries, I was in it for about 10 years as an aeronautical engineer, aerospace, on the Gemini program and others. I took a position at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. There was it sounded interesting at the time. I thought I'd go there for a year or two to see what the government was like. It was with the intelligence activities, Foreign Technology Division. I was analyzing foreign systems, missiles and airplanes. And because of my background in the Gemini program, I moved into that very quickly and started working at FTD, the Foreign Technology Division. And my responsibilities were working on trends and forecasts. About 5 to 10 years, what are the Soviets going to be doing with new missiles and new airplanes? So it was really a fun job, and I liked it. I didn't see any point in going back to industry at that time. And then along comes this temporary assignment. It took me to Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii. And that's in the 68, 69 time frame. And Vietnam is just raging. And I was brought there as part of a new group set up specifically to improve the survivability of Air Force pilots on missions, flying missions in Vietnam. I developed a presentation on airplane tactics, MiG versus U.S., Soviet airplane versus U.S., and they hadn't seen that kind of presentation graphically presented. So I presented that throughout in Japan and in Vietnam and in Okinawa and other places. It was during that experience when I had this. I heard stories about pilots that did things they couldn't really anticipate or predict about avoiding this and that, and soldiers in Vietnam have stories about knowing when not to move forward and that. So I thought that was intriguing, and then I had this really incredible situation where I learned some of that firsthand, some of what can happen in these traumatic situations when, unbeknownst to me, I had a surf on one day. It was a very high surf, and the red flags were up. Nobody should be out there, but I felt macho-like, having just come back from a long trip. So I went out there, my little flotation pad, just the 3.5-foot thing you buy in a grocery store, just to do body surfing. So I'm out there a while, and I have to come back, and it's getting windy, and the waves are 3 to 6 feet, trough to peak. Nobody out there, no lifeguard, hardly anybody on the beach. And I was coming back, and I thought I heard somebody call for help, although I thought it might have been a seagull. I gave up on it and kept going back. But then I intuitively turned around and went out into toward the open ocean, toward the coral reefs. And I went as far as I could, and I couldn't go any farther. I knew I'd run into the coral reefs, and about to turn back when I came down a wave and bumped into a woman that was being sucked out in a riptide. And I got her on board and got her, she was semi-conscious, couldn't talk or anything, and got her on the pad. I had to get in the water, and with one arm, power to hold her on. And finally looked at her, and I saw it was my wife. I saw she had gone in and got sucked up by one of these big waves that happens in Hawaii on the beaches many times. People don't understand the danger of those big waves. So after a long time, it seemed I was able to bring both of us back, and they didn't think that I was able to do that. And during that experience, I found myself looking down at these two people on this funny little pad, this white little styrofoam pad. That's me and my wife down there. And somehow I had no pain because I almost couldn't even feel anything anymore from the struggling. And ultimately, somehow, with this higher vision, you might call, I was able to get back to shore with her. And ultimately, she got back to breathing normally after draining the water out of her lungs. So that was a traumatic situation. So I come back to Wright-Patterson a year later and began studying this phenomenon. How did I do this? Just more than intuition. How could I know somebody was out there? She told me she never even screamed because she couldn't. She had too much water. So it was not me hearing one voice and going toward it in the waves, and I couldn't have known where to go anyway. And the sound of the crashing waves. So that led me into parapsychology. Got the Journal of Parapsychology. I got to read about what J.B. Wright did. Was working at ESP. I got interested in that. I took courses in psychology at Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. Studied statistics. Got to learn how to do experimental setups with human subjects, not scientific things that don't have people involved too much, but human people, how to work with people, how to evaluate subjective material. I got into that. A set of experiments with local individuals. And I also discovered when I was reading the literature, because that was part of my job, was to continually look at the classified literature from Russia and what looked interesting. Sometimes the titles were translated, but that was all. I just sent it to our translation department to have the rest of the article deciphered. And I found articles there about Soviet ESP that I wrote in a little 1 or 2 page memo. I thought it was kind of silly to put in my usual reports, but I put it in anyway. It's sort of a hunch. We know what the heck. I can only be laughed at. But the commander liked it, and they said keep following it. This topic in the Soviet Union, what are the Soviets really doing? Is this real? Are they doing something we should be knowing about? So I started doing that on the side, collecting that literature, and then about the same, and I published in a little paper that eventually made its way into the National Intelligence Estimates, which is a really strong position to be for any prediction in terms of the intelligence community and the R&D community. So I did all that, and then by chance, you might say, Harold Putoff and Russell Targ came to the Foreign Technology Division. They were looking for funding. The CIA that had previously funded them that dropped the program with the funding. And here I am, having just told the commander about Soviet ESP, and there's Helen Russ telling him about the U.S. work in remote viewing, which ironically I had not known a lot about, if anything. I was more concerned about the foreign stuff. So anyway, I was appointed as the contract manager for the SRI work in remote viewing. So that's how I got into it.
Wow. So there's a lot to unpack there because, I mean, let's go back to this story. So you were working at the Foreign Technology Division in the Air Force. Yeah. And one day, you know, separate from that, but you were working there at the time, you happened to be out surfing. Yeah. And I recall from our conversation, your wife got worried about you or something of that nature because it was the tides or it was getting really bad out there and she went looking for you. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure. She was concerned. First of all, the red flag was up and she was concerned. There's no question about it. I think she just got a little too close to the waves. And if you've ever been in any Hawaiian surf area or even in the Caribbean at times, you get these rogue waves that just leap up and then you do a face plant in the sand, mm-hmm. as they call it. And that's mm-hmm. what hit her. She's standing or working along the edge. She can't, she's not a swimmer. She wasn't going to go in the water. And that big wave just sucked her out.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was a really focused riptide, apparently, because he really took her out of waves.
Yeah, I recall a story not long ago of a young lady who went out to some rocks to meditate, and while she was deep in meditation, the waves got a little strong, came over, hit her, pulled her into the ocean, and she drowned. Yeah. So yeah, it's a real thing. So. Just to kind of make this really clean. So your wife went out there. She was a little concerned. She was standing on the edge of the water. The water pulled her out. You did not know this, correct? You didn't know any of that.
No, because she told me she would not be in the water at all because she might have gone waded. I didn't want her to do that. I didn't expect her to be in the water at all.
Yeah. So then you're coming back to shore, and then you kind of get like this, and you recognize that if the water's getting bad, it's getting bad out there. So you're kind of like done. You're coming in, and you say you hear help, and so that kind of gives you an idea that you need to turn around, or the feeling you need to turn around and go and look for that person, or see if there's anyone who needs help. You can't see anybody, and somehow you end up bumping into this woman that's drowning out in the middle of out there. And being sucked up in this riptide, you start to help her. You try to get her back. But I recall when we originally had the story that you were saying you became super exhausted trying to carry her back to shore. Oh, yeah. And at some point you thought you were going to drown and you were going to give up. And at that point, you remembered seeing yourself above You remember being above your body, looking down at you, holding this woman, and then somehow that gave you the inspiration to actually pull through and make it to shore. Am I correct on that?
Yeah, sure. I just didn't go into all the details. The story was long enough.
Well, I just want to clarify because,
True, that's just a missing piece of it. Sure.
Yeah, yeah.
But even the other little pieces too. My logical mind kept saying, as I was there wondering what to do with this impossible call for help, which she never made, since she couldn't scream. And even if she had, I wouldn't have been able to hear it in that noise. It was so loud, and it was a squall coming in, so it was really windy and loud. So, I thought I heard a voice, but it couldn't have been a voice. So it was whatever I heard was all in my mind. So now I don't know if I told you this at that discussion we had, and we couldn't talk about this. It had too much emotion in it for years. So we finally did get to discussing it, and I asked her what exactly was she thinking? What was she knowing as she was being swept out, knowing that she couldn't swim? And I said, did you ever attempt to call? And she said, absolutely no, I could not. You opened my mouth without getting water in it. I couldn't scream. I wanted to. So did you think about calling? And she said, well, maybe I did. I'm not sure. But as I'm being swept out, I don't think I mentioned this part to you. She told me, and again, this is a discussion this years later. She told me that she had this tremendous feeling of peace that came over her, and that somehow she would be saved. And so that was her feeling. She was totally at peace when I found her out there in that bottom of this wave. So somehow she must have known at a subconscious level that somebody was coming out there to find her.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
And so that story, that encounter led you to start saying, I need to know more about what happened. What is this a psi phenomenon? What is this phenomenon that happened to me? And that kind of pushed you in the direction of studying a little bit more about parapsychology, which led you to find out more, or come across the Soviets' ESP papers, and then you started to look into that, and that your report on that is actually went up to the your higher ups, and then at the same time, Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ ended up coming and talking about this ESP thing at the same time. So it's very reminiscent of the story of Skip Atwater, and how he said he came about like through these very odd and unexplainable circumstances. He ended up coming to the remote viewing topic. And, to the point where he ended up getting hired and going somewhere and opening the desk of the new desk that he's at. And there's a paper in there, a classified document, which should not have been in there, of a guy who was studying about remote viewing, and when he had already been down that path and kind of got sidetracked, but this pulled him back on. And his statement is that plans were made. He would say that all the time because some of the things that happened to him were so unbelievable at how he was brought to remote viewing and then to continue down that path, even after he was on it, got sidetracked, moved away from it, and then it somehow ended up managing sitting at this desk one day and having this paper. It sounds like you too were almost led in that way. And again, if I'm misquoting or misspeaking, please correct me. But
it's like a path through synchronicities, something like that,
Yeah. And it's so weird that both of you were instrumental in not only creating the program and building the program, but you actually was instrumental in keeping it alive for a long period of time.
Yes, and when Skip gave that talk at the conference that we were at Charlottesville, he added a detail that I was not aware of, and you approached it here. The document that he found in the desk, he was very specific about what that document was. It was a document that I wrote, which compiled the summary of the Soviet work.
Like, what did it, like, again, what are the chances, you know?
I've thought that many times, and I agree. And Skip did come up to visit me, of course. You mentioned that at the conference as well. And I knew right away that eventually I'd be working with it with Skip in some capacity. Now, I'm at FTD. I have no plans of leaving FTD. It's a great environment in Dayton. I loved it there. And yeah, all that aviation history. And this
The
is
Foreign Technologies Division, just for
right.
anyone.
This is 1978 or so when this encounter with him occurred. So I'm not planning on going to Washington at all. In fact, I didn't really think that's the place I wanted to go at all. But then I end up there, unplanned. And then ultimately, worked with him in a liaison role when I first came down there. I would say down, that's to DIA in Washington, D.C. And then, as you mentioned earlier, eventually being transferred as the actual chief of the unit later on in the duration of it. So yeah, so you're right. I've often thought about this. Given I didn't have some connection that synchronized the crazy things that we were brought into.
Yeah. So here's a good question for you before, because I want to unpack some other things, but I'm gonna try not to put you on the spot, but put you on the spot at the same time. With all the talk about NHIs and non-human intelligences and our interaction with maybe beings that we don't 100% understand, one of the things that comes up sometimes is this idea that some of them may be trying to give us little hints to push us along. Mm-hmm. And then you hear stories like this and how instrumental remote viewing is in the community of our understanding of what we're capable of as multidimensional beings. And you're like, without, even though ancients have talked about this, Patanjali talks about this in the Yoga Sutras, remote viewing as a thing. And in the ninja culture, we talk about it as well. And there's other cultures that talk about it. But even though we were talking about it in that light, the remote viewing program really brought it to the scientific aspect for us to actually start studying and doing some hard research on this out of the mystical realm and into the scientific realm, where we're able to prove that this thing exists and really dive deep into it. And so what's your take on that? Is it just synchronicity, just the time, the universe? Do you kind of feel sometimes, based on your story and the stories you've heard, that there's something else there that might be kind of guiding the way a little bit?
Oh, I've thought about this a lot. And in fact, I want to add one piece of history, which I feel sometimes is overlooked, and that's the dream state. There was earlier work that was done at the Maimonides Medical Center in looking at people's dreams. Could they recall dreams of a target picture? This is in the 60s and 70s, and that preceded remote viewing work. So I use that as a reference point too. So we're looking at two aspects of our consciousness: the sleep consciousness, if that's what you want to call it, and the awake state, the remote viewing side. So I like to be an integrator to bring both these aspects of our mental world together. Now, looking at dreams, I think there's sometimes a little bit more insight gained from dream work, particularly when you consider lucid dreaming in terms of interactions with dream figures or whatever the dream figures represent. And sometimes they don't seem to be just a figment of one's imagination or dream world imagination. They seem more real. So here's another area to bring into the equation. What are these dream figures telling us? Is this some kind of connection from the deep subconscious? And if you studied Carl Jung and the idea of the collective unconscious, and of course he was a big dream worker, pioneer in the same capacity, basically professionally, as Sigmund Freud in the turn of the century, 1900s. And he perceived the collective unconscious as in enveloping all of us. So we already have a concept here that I picked up on and carried it on into my remote viewing experiences and involvement. That there is something here. It's at a deep collective. Now, is it something that's embedded in some evolutionary principle, and we perceive it in certain ways that we understand in conventional languages and terms, like the UFO figure could be a symbol for a deep dive into the subconscious, not necessarily something from outer space. So whatever this deep connection is that we have through lucid dreaming and through remote viewing, we are connecting with something that I believe, more than believe, suspect, is providing hints. You might say guidance, nudges, to move toward a more unifying perspective, a more integrative view of our place in the universe. So, yeah, I think there's an evolutionary push here. And we're not going to be able to fully understand this for some time yet, although we get hints of it. And we interpret the experiences differently. So there's a lot of room here for discussion, and I'm sure we'll have that at your conference in August.
August, yeah.
Well, it's like crowdsourcing, like contact modalities, or the different ways that parapsychology has looked at over the years. And I wanted to get your opinion, Dale, about, because you mentioned like J.B. Rhine, and I think people I resonate with your story and experience, because I had an experience and looked heavy into parapsychology. But I wonder, like at that time, parapsychology was maybe relatively kind of new, Ryan, they were kind of building the field. So what was it? You mentioned the Journal of Parapsychology. That was probably sort of new, but what was it back then that was kind of making a strong case for ESP? And there seems to be a different interest, because I feel like when it started at Duke, there was a strong interest from students. Students were the main subjects, and then it maybe went in a different direction. So maybe you can talk about the development of parapsychology in the field of that, how it's gone.
Yes, ironically, when I discovered the Journal of Parapsychology, it was in the library at Honolulu, of all the places to find a stack of that journal. I couldn't find it anywhere else when I came back and started looking for it. So here's this obscure journal in this remote, from my point of view, this remote location. And I could, that journal didn't exist. Maybe it did, but I couldn't find it anywhere when I started looking around. But in looking at that, and I really have studied the Rhine work as well, and I really have a great admiration for the students that stayed with J.B. Rhine and achieved those great results. But on the other hand, it had to shift somewhere into terms that might be more practical. And I think the dream work that showed up in Maimonides was the beginning of that, because they worked it in with other aspects of the dream life. So, and around this time, there was a large movement also from the from the Eastern traditions coming into this country. And I remember seeing many yoga instructors locally even. So there was this big push at that time in the 70s. It's like a zeitgeist, like something was opening up. And then people just showed up that would be helpful. To consider the work with Hal and Russ at SRI. What's the probability of people like Pat Price and Ingo Swann showing up at this time, and totally diverse individuals from different, totally psychological profiles, and one's a creative guy and the other's more of a technical guy. Pat Price, the policeman, is also a draftsman. But these two came together to read, and others too, but they were the driving points of the SRI work early on. what brought them together? And the right people came together. And then even at FTD, when I finally got into this contract and set up my own little exploratory group there, I had no idea I'd even find anybody that wanted to talk about the topic. And the scientific environment that I was in, really analytic oriented, which is what we were. We were analysts, scientists, physicists, engineers. And here are people here right around the corner from where I was working that really had talent. I was just waiting for somebody to talk to somebody. Here I am. Talk to me. Tell me about your experiences. And they were really mind-blowing. How could this be? So there were people there ready to go. Didn't have to train anybody. So there's something else going on here. We talked about synchronicity, but I think it's more than that. It overreaches. It's a wider web than just say individual synchronicities that are orchestrating this stuff together, which is what I think is happening. There are little nudges, and some people happen to get into the flow, whether they want to or not. So, and then they wonder, how did they get there? They wonder, how can I get out of it? No,
that's classic. It's so true. You know what's really cool that you say that is, my teacher had my martial arts teacher. We trained in ninjutsu, and he would tell us the story about working with you. And I was young, and I thought it was interesting and awesome, but it was like I was more into the physical. Like, oh yeah, show me more of the physical stuff. Let's do a little meditation. Show me some more of the physical stuff. And he would talk about this. And so later, I had no idea that 20 years later, I would end up finding out more about remote viewing, becoming interested in it at that time. Mm-hmm. And then meeting you, mm-hmm. who's the guy he was talking about. And I didn't even know that until, the time came about. So once I started learning about remote viewing, and I talked to him again, and he was like, oh, yeah, it was a guy. I asked him who he worked with. He said it's a guy named Dale Graff. And then I swear, like only a month later, I think, or 2 months later, I'm sitting across from you interviewing you at the IRVA conference, Yeah. And I'm like, and now here I am starting the Psi Games as part of a greater extension of that whole thing. And so, again, like you say, these nudges, these things that are happening, that it just really makes you say, what's going on here?
Let me add a little bit more to that. You're talking about Stephen Hayes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, another thing I did when I really started diving into the Soviet work, I actually set up study groups in the area and a study program in the local evening educational system in Dayton, Ohio. I called it the psychic realm. I used the word psychic, although I realized my remote viewing colleagues don't like that word, but it was a word that people understood. If I would have advertised, I'm running a remote viewing course locally, nobody would have shown up. But throw out the psychic word, and then you can go from there. So that was my philosophy. And one of my first students was Stephen Hayes. And he said, I'm so happy to see this program being offered. I have so many things I want to talk to you about. And we really did have a lot of dialogue with in his later stages of the way he perceives his advancement in his form of martial arts and, reacting before the opponent or the partner. They don't like to think in terms of opponent. It's the partner that you're combating. You react before your partner responds or even thinks about it. Well, I shouldn't say things, but he does anything, just react ahead of time. So he's quite into precognition, even though it might be fractions of a second ahead of time before he blocks the blow. But so he did really well on my experimental projects I had set up, and I had one I ran his course for 10 nights, 10 months. 10 months. One night. 10 weeks. I got my timing it off. 10 weeks, and I did an experiment for every week. And on the first experiment, he really did well on the type of experiment I set up, which was modeled after the Maimonides approach of dreaming and doing remote viewing. By this time, I was familiar enough with remote viewing to work that into the program. And he was able to do both, the conscious state and dream state. And then he in the middle of the 10-week program, he went on. He had to depart for a week. He played the backup to the movie actor Richard Chamberlain in the movie Shogun.
Yeah.
Did I tell you about that? He played backup because he was a big, strong guy. And he was a martial arts guy, as you know, and he was one of the bodyguards. Stephen Hayes was a bodyguard for the Dalai Lama when he came into the country. So during the filming of the Shogun movie, there was something burning on the ship, and Richard Chamberlain was supposed to dive over into the water. Of course, Stephen Hayes came in and did the diving. But during this episode, this is the time that I had the remote viewing project or the dream project set up. And he moved into a corner somewhere and worked on the project, waiting for the signal before he would tell him to dive over the ship.
That's a cool story. I did not know that part. That's yeah.
Then he sent it to me because this is before internet, so we were dealing by mail. I don't remember if I got it right away or not, but eventually I got his input. It was really quite good. But here he is on a fake burning on a ship that should be sinking and is ready to dive into the water. That's Stephen Hayes. I tell you, I give a tremendous amount of credit, you know. And then a few years ago, he was in Philadelphia and gave me a call and said, "Yeah, can we get together?" So I went to Philadelphia. I'm about 100 miles from there. And we had a really wonderful afternoon. And he felt he needed to get back in shape. Could I set up a target for him? So I did a 20, 30-minute thing. And once again, he made a really good sketch. And I suggested that he get it framed and put it in his study or wherever he keeps things like that as a memento of reconnecting after all those years. You know, I'm talking about 1976, 1977 time frame when I first met him.
Yeah, that's beautiful. There are two things that I want to touch on as well. Thank you for that. And I'm going to share this with him. And one is, you know, I love how you're linking the dream state as well as the waking state. When we look at yoga has the term, you know, or the sound Om. And in Vedanagari, it's AUM and then silence. And so that's this idea of this waking state, dream state, deep sleep state, and then transcendence. Mm-hmm. And so Om in itself is the unification of all those states of being, and then actually moving beyond the state and being, you know, pretty much nothingness at the beginning. And so it's awesome to hear that even from a scientific perspective and you're studying and your research, you're moving in that, you know, you're looking at, okay, this is what we can do in the waking state. What are we doing in the dream state? And then I know there are other people, you know, doing research on what we do in the deep dream state, and, you know, and then how that, and hopefully how the unification of all those allows room for transcendence of any state. And so I just wanted to touch on that because I think, you know, it's really cool to hear someone that has been doing that type of research. And I'm sure there are other people out there. But my main question for you is, what do you think about the deep dream state? And, you know, versus, because you have the waking state and the sleep state, what about the deep dream state and how that might relate to, and how all of those might help you move into this transcendent state?
Okay, well, the deep dream states, you know, if you're referring to levels that you can achieve in lucid dreaming or other forms of dreaming, but in lucid dreaming, you can go to what I would call deeper levels. Now, how do you define that level? Is it the symbolism you run into? Is it the feeling you run into? Is it the void you pass through to go into the next region of the space? But there is something at what you might call a basement of our subconscious being, however we get there, wherever it is. There's some ground, I shouldn't use the word ground. It's not ground. It's a lower, a different, deeper level than we can achieve. And when you get into there is this universal peace feeling. It's just different than what you might experience in even some of the more altered levels of say that you can achieve in remote viewing or ordinary dreaming. It's something that goes beyond. And I might have to draw a little bit what I might have read or recall from the dream yoga, which is another nice, great tradition from the world, achieving this unity of feeling, which can move constantly between the so-called awake and so-called dream to where they're actually fused. I don't know if I want to quite go that far right now. I'm not ready for that. But there's ability to just keep constantly moving. So this is deeper and deeper, and then coming back to what we call the awake state. And even in lucid dreaming, you have terms like waking reality, or as if the whole reality is a dream. And we wake into reality as well as we wake into dreams. So it's one way of looking at it. There's no question from my experiences when I've met with some of my remote viewing colleagues, and they really are into the healing world, the abilities that we have, can draw on. So there's energetics of some kind involved here as well. The ability to access what appear to be different energetic levels. So you mentioned earlier your analogy to ocean waves, and different frequencies with them, and different ways we ride the waves, so to speak. I do like that analogy. But also energy involved in waves, even though it's not the kind of waves that we think of. It was electromagnetics, but maybe it's an analogous thing, but not. I can't link that with electromagnetics in the way we understand electromagnetics. So yes, there's a deeper level, and these ancient traditions, I think, offer wonderful pathways to explore them, and then what we bring back from them, or whatever we can interpret from the experience, and whatever abilities that is bestowed upon us while we're there in these experiences, which again could be on heightened psi abilities and heightened empathies, healing abilities. You become a much different type of individual in terms of the ability and also what you sense and feel around you. You don't have the hard link to ego personality anymore. You don't give it away naturally. You wouldn't survive in this world if you did. But there's a way of moving around that, and at the same time moving way beyond it. I don't know. I know what I said helps you or not.
That was deep. Maybe you got that out of the deep.
Yeah, sometimes I don't know what I'm saying, so I listen to it afterwards.
Well, when I talk to a lot of people in spaces about experiences and dreams, but I think a lot of the time what they really want is how to achieve an out-of-body experience. Okay. Mm-hmm. And so I wonder, with your knowledge and experience with remote viewing, did you guys ever really venture into, because you look at the Ganzfeld or sensory deprivation, were there ever any characteristics that you studied that would help people or guide people toward having an out-of-body experience?
Well, again, the question of what is an out-of-body experience and what is a different level of the lucid dream state. And my colleagues in the International Association for the Study of Dreams, and I'm very active in that organization as well as I am with the remote viewing group. But in their view, and it's split, some will say a lucid dream is not an OBE, and others will say it's another level, another part of the spectrum. So if there is a movement when you're in a lucid dream to become more like an OBE, then the lucid dream would be an entry point. And there are a number of ways to become lucid in a dream. Carlos Castanedas, he wrote that famous book back in the 60s. And, you're looking at your hand and saying, when I see my head in a dream, I'll know I'm dreaming, and I'll become conscious, become a lucid dreamer. This is one common technique for becoming lucid in a dream. So once you're there, then you can roam around and do the explorations. And also, and I've done this myself, become lucid, but then have that lucidity become more like an OBE, because the difference would be, in my experience, in a lucid, the OBE, it's very difficult, if not nearly impossible, to change the boundaries of it, to change the content. You're there. You don't. Maybe it's because you're not trying, but I don't think you can change the environment when you're in it. In lucid dreaming, you can kind of push things around and move through barriers, for example. But the outer body seems fixed, very, very real. Now you're moving around in it. You're mobile. You're traveling. You're looking at this and looking at that, and it just seems like this reality, the one we're in now, only is as real as what we experience conventionally. So, but to get into that state, I'm only familiar with arriving there through the lucid dream side. Now, what I experienced in that surf situation, I'm not sure that I would call it an OBE, because I'm certainly not asleep and dreaming. Far from what.
Well, it sounded like a near-death experience as well. Like, do you see that happening in sort of the same plane or level? Yeah.
Good point. I've thought about that, and when I studied the NDE experiences, and I did a lot of work or research into that topic as well years ago. And I think the Ryan Research Center right now, I think they're still there. The NDE group is sharing a space there, and I used to read the journals when I visited. But it looks like the NDE can appear like an OBE at first, and then beyond that, when you go into the more spiritual or other dimensional aspects of that, I can't really say for sure. I've not been there myself, but I think the trauma that I had, which really I didn't realize was traumatic until after I thought about it, but the trauma was almost a trigger for this, and also the giving up. I kind of hate to admit this, but I almost gave up on that struggle. Having to make a really tough decision, I didn't mention this before, but this is the emotional part of it. I almost gave up on that, and then something happened to me that threw me into this very peaceful feeling, and then the OBE. But that is like a near-death experience. I entered it pretty much like the NDE people describe their entry experience. It wasn't, I wasn't drowning, I wasn't shot and dying, and it wasn't anything like that. But I wasn't in an auto accident. And watching myself walk around the accident scene afterwards, and I've heard stories about that too. But there's a connection, I think, with the kind of, you hate to make that connection, but it does seem that there is a link to this, what I call a traumatic incident, and other people's trauma when they're facing death or actually going through that phase. There's connection.
Well, I think that, from my research, that it seems like when we enter a flow state, so that's a key term now, flow state, right? And so I've been in the military, and there's been some crazy situations that I've seen, that I've been a part of, and you enter what essentially feels like a flow state. But I've also been an athlete. And then through intense focus, I've also entered that flow state. So there's reactive flow state from like a trauma or a traumatic event that's happening, and then you get kind of immersed in it. And I have personally, and the people I've talked to can't tell the difference between the flow state that you get into if you're playing a really intense basketball game, you know, like it just happens. All of a sudden, you're just enjoying yourself. You're having the time of your life and you're there, you know, everything's working right for you. And then like now it's this very traumatic experience, but then you're in that kind of same state. Everything's working right. You're making all the right moves. You're seeing things before they happen. And so I wonder, you know, many spiritual teachers say, you know, fear is one way to have certain experiences, but love is way to have many of those same experiences. And when you listen to people like Jake Barber, who just came out about this term psionics and using, you heard him talking about, you know, that they would use like people who had trauma in their past or people from this fear-based element. But then you talk to some spiritual teachers and they'll say, oh yeah, I was able to have these experiences and do this stuff, but from a loving perspective, I felt nothing but pure love. I felt light. I felt warm. And so they're both having these abilities to see things and predict things, but one is coming out of a trauma or fear-based element, and the other one is coming from a love and peace based element. And so maybe in some way they're two sides of the same coin. So when I hear NDE and OBE and how people are arriving there, but the OBE, it seems quite often people are getting there through these states of very like gamma or theta or these, you know, they go really deep into these meditative practices and they have these OBEs, whereas NDEs is like normally I'm having a traumatic event but I still kind of arrive in the same, you know, place.
Yeah.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, right. Well, again, I didn't, there's a little bit more to the story in the surf because it was after I pulled this up on the shore is when I actually entered something like you're describing. It says afterwards, this really feeling of flow and connection with something beyond myself. You know, you might call it a deep love of the universe, of my wife. And you know, just that feeling there. This is true love. So that was the end result as I'm on the shore trying to recover my own strength to get up and get moving again. So that fit in that experience was what you're saying. But going back to flow, the flow thing, or being in the zone, which was an earlier term used decades ago by a colleague of mine, Ray White, who published a book on the zone, being in the zone. I found something like that in, like you mentioned, in athletics, in sports. One of my hobbies, well, not really a hobby, vocation, was whitewater canoeing. And I spent a lot of time in the Canadian rivers, all the way to the big rivers that flow into Hudson's Bay and the Arctic Ocean. Some of those rivers are 500 miles long. And it's during those times in these remote wilderness regions, in this tundra, we actually, and going through the rapids, and knowing that this danger, you've done the best you can. There's the mapping and the reading, but there's still this uncertainty, and the uncertainty really heightens your focus. You don't hear anything around you. You don't even hear the roar of the rapids. You're just so focused on the next wave and the next boulder. Can you paddle? Can you do a stroke, a J stroke to get over there, or do you have to back pedal? Or you have to ferry out of it. So all these thoughts go through your mind, but it's quick. You don't even analyze it. You don't even hear anything. So I've been through that, and I think that's sort of similar to what these people coming down and making that buzzer beater, like we've seen so dramatically the past couple of days, and on the Sweet 16 plays. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it ties into competition. I think going into like Psi Games, Dale, what do you think about? Do you think we've talked with the guests before about whether competition with psychic phenomenon and Psi elevates the ability? You know, like using an event like this and initiative to people who are skilled and the best of the best. You know, like the competition that it would elevate the Psi and maybe contribute to the research as well.
Yeah, I think there will be those people that it will definitely accomplish that goal. But there are also going to be people that will be resistant. And I ran into these individuals years ago when I first started doing instructions in the local area. I would find people come up to me and say, well, yeah, I don't mind listening to what you're explaining about the research and what your understanding is from a scientific basis, what the phenomena may or may not be. But I don't really want to use it for this purpose or that purpose. You know, you've got a lot of heat over the years. How can you use this wonderful talent for espionage? You know, you're corrupting the field in their mind. So I say, well, you know, we don't have any problem with people with detectives using psychics, remote viewers, whatever you're going to call them, for solving a crime. So why should you be bothered by somebody that wants to prevent the country from going to war by coming up with secrets that might be useful for preventing an attack or finding somebody that's missing might otherwise not survive. So it's useful, isn't it? And it makes sense from a survival point of view. And then I think this is the key here. We're looking at something ancient, something goes way back to the beginning of whatever brains were in whatever form, based around survival and competition. So you compete to survive. You compete to avoid being attacked by the tiger. You know, you compete for the food source. Get across the hill before the other tribe finds the bounty. So you have that embedded in us. It is a competition aspect to it. And I think as we get into Psi Games, that is an element that I think we'll see coming out more than people that might resist. Now, there may be practical reasons why you may not want to do it. You know, maybe you don't want to be but again, most people are through that phase by the time they would come to a Psi Game event. Or if they're not, we can, I think, educate them out of it real quick. You don't have to be afraid to be good. You don't have to be afraid to not be good. You know, relax and be a natural. Go with what's that word? Flow you used?
Yeah.
Yeah. So don't worry about it. Do it. And if it looks like competition, then that's what it is. And if you like competition, great, go for it. And I think we can psych people up and get them to go. And I like the story that J.B. Ryan wrote in one of his books. And I think it's always valuable to go back to the root of this research. And even before J.B. Ryan, it just didn't start with remote viewing. There's a long history here that people seem to want to sometimes not talk about. But in J.B. Ryan's time, he did have competition. He had a group of students from the psychology department compete against the students from the religion department. And they had a lot of fun with that. The religion people versus the non-religion people. So yeah, this competition. And by the way, the religion people won. Not by very much, but from the statistics that he was able to generate from just a short period of trial. So it's fine, you know. You don't have to think of it like Stephen Hayes. I don't like to think of it as so much a competition, but as a cooperation between partners. Okay, I might do better. I like to do better than you. It doesn't matter if I do or not. You know, I wish you luck too. You know, I'll cheer for the opponent as well as I'll hope for myself to win in a Psi game. So I think I'm shifting back kind of to a martial arts attitude here. And maybe that's what we can instill in the Psi Games if people have some uneasy feeling about it and about competition or not. You don't have to look at it as competition. It's always a learning experience.
Yeah, learning I think, some of the things that I've been saying consistently about why the Psi Games exists is that it's building a community that's fun, that's not wrapped up in a lot of pressure that you might find in a research laboratory. But you just have fun with it. There's a community there. There's collaboration. There's inspiration. When let's say I see the next at the Psi Games, we see the next Pat Price, who could do things we didn't even know were possible. That opens up a whole new door of possibility on what we start to practice and how we look at our abilities to do certain things. And so that helps us identify new parameters, identify new levels and heights that we can go to. And some people will take that on and say, I want to try that and get better. And then that takes us to a whole new level of consciousness. And we have all of these books of these sages and people who have walked the earth, who have done these things, who have been inspiring people for generations with their stories about what they've done and what we know from, that they've passed down. And so if you do meditation for this long, these things happen, this pure bliss happens. And that comes from this inspiration of this person trying it out and going to stay on a mountain for God knows how long and freeze their butt off to get to this state at which they were able to come back and share, which motivated and inspired whole generations to try that out as well. And so I think it can be really positive. But I don't want to get too far anymore down that rabbit hole, because I did want to ask you, Dale, before we leave, to just kind of explain how you go from that first meeting with Hal Puthoff and Russell Targ at the FTD, the Foreign Technologies Division, to then diving deeper into remote viewing, and then at some point becoming the head of it. And then tell us how long you did that, how you became the head, and give us a little bit of that history.
All right. Yeah, there is a odd history here, because like I mentioned earlier, I had no plan to move to Washington, D.C. I had no idea I'd eventually be working for the Defense Intelligence Agency. But while I was at FTD, and people found me that I had remote viewing ability, and they also were good lucid dreamers, so that they were able to do both modes of the disability that we're talking about. But whatever the case, I'm working with them, and I'm wondering what to do next. This is 1976. I just became the contract manager for SRI on every remote viewing after writing a statement of work and beating that together. And then I decided to set up this little exploratory group. And this woman came in and said she has really ability and heard about this work and all. So I worked with her, and I wrote a paper. Because I'm thinking about this. This is Air Force. Thrust into this, maybe I should write a little paper about what can the Air Force expect from remote viewing. And I didn't want to move too far into the technical intelligence per se. I wanted it to be more gradual, something that related to the Air Force more directly. So I wrote a protocol on how to find missing airplanes, and I thought this should be a good one as an opener. There's always an airplane missing somewhere, and the Air Force does lose them occasionally. So, and this is before we had all these wonderful tracking devices. So I wrote that paper, and it wasn't more than a week's passed when I'm called into the top secret project that had to do with finding an airplane. And somehow the individual was aware of this protocol I wrote. I said, well, see if you can get your people, one or two of them, it's about what I had at the time, to work in this project and to find this missing airplane. We've been looking for it for some weeks now, and we can't continue the search much longer. Do you think you or your people can provide clues or guidance or information? I said, yeah. I wrote the paper. Now I got to put up what I said. So I approached this woman, and been working with in local little experimental projects who did real well. And I didn't know where the airplane was. They just said there's a missing airplane, but they did tell me it was a Soviet airplane, a Tu-22. A blinder is a code name for it, Tu-22 light medium bomber style airplane. So, okay, I went into a session, a remote viewing style session, the kind that Hal Puthoff and Russ Targ used. We're not using any process other than sitting and focusing on the objective. This is before training techniques were developed that have a more rigid set approach to it and steps. And we didn't have that at that time. This is 1979 when this happened. So I go through the protocol I set up, phase one, which is relaxed, which didn't take her long to relax. She's very good at that. And then the prompt, here's a picture of a missing airplane. Please provide information that will allow the search team to find the airplane. That was it. So I sat back and waited 15, 20 minutes. Every now and then I'd remind her, to find the airplane, something like that. And then she came up with a sketch, and it looked like a nice little sketch of mountains and a lake and drew the path of an airplane over the lake. So I handed that to the search team, and it wasn't too long before they came and said, can we go to whatever your next steps are? Because what she sketched does seem to correlate with something on the map. And I brought her to my phase two was working with the map. So we took her into the map area, which is a topographic map that was on the wall, covered a couple 100 miles by 100 mile of area in Africa, small places in Africa. And they showed me the sketch that I'd given them, and she said, this. Went to the map and said, this sort of reminds me of what I was seeing in this vision that I had. She used the term vision. And went to the map and put a mark on it. And then that mark was converted to a coordinate because the search team was in Africa looking for the airplane, and they had to get out of country in a day or two, so they had to act fast. They had been there about a week. Unbeknownst to the country that they were in, Uganda at the time. So the search team in Africa looked at that coordinate and saw that it was like 60 miles from where they were looking, where they thought the plane was, but they had one more shot at it, sent a helicopter over there. And when they landed there, they were greeted with they found natives that had fragments of the airplane. That's where the airplane had crashed, within about a mile or two of where the mark was on the map. So this is spectacular. And before long, this thing goes all the way up top. And I'm now in the Pentagon explaining what we did, and nobody believed us. And she must have known something. No. And I proved beyond any shadow of a doubt that information got there before the airplane was even found. So how could we have told anybody what it was from some information from the field if they didn't even have it yet? So we go through that phase, and I had all kinds of backup on that. NSA and CIA backed it up. But the information was too spectacular. And it went to the top, and then eventually President Carter talked about it openly at meetings and ceremonies, and other congressmen also talked about it. So this top secret project was not blown, and it was no longer, our activity at FTD was now well known, and we were getting all kinds of press, and the Air Force didn't like it. And ultimately, through some other thing that happened with another study that I was involved in, and using psychics or remote viewers to locate missiles in movable vehicles or in randomly selected silos, are part of what's called the MX program. And that information really stirred up the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, and he actually canceled everything we were doing, everything. So I was removed from the program or the project of whatever we were doing with SRI. I had to cancel the contract. I had to stop doing my foreign assessment work. And I just won a prestigious award that was awarded annually by the the director of Central Intelligence, called the Outstanding Analyst Award. I'd written a proposal for something not clearly related to remote viewing, but I lumped it in with remote viewing and non-ionizing electromagnetic radiation, if you can believe that. And it won the award, and I was all set to go and receive this big award in D.C. And the night before, the telephone call comes in that General Lou Allen, Chief of Staff for the Air Force, had canceled everything, including my award.
Wow.
Everything killed. So,
and why was that done?
That is a good question, and we've been debating that. I know Hal's been debating it. I've been debating it. Others, everybody. Why? There's speculation, and the technical one is that if this phenomenon is real, then Soviets who use remote viewing or something similar could defeat the MX basing scheme, where now you have to, which was based on a probability 1 out of 10, 1 out of 100. But if remote viewers can up that to 1 out of 5, or even more than that, 1 out of 2, then you in principle can defeat that concept with Soviet remote viewers. And I think when Lou Allen heard about that, he didn't want anybody else to even know about remote viewing. Because somebody in a budget area might actually believe it and therefore cancel the program, the MX program. That's one theory. The other theory is that there might have been something that he really had a problem with the basic phenomenon. And I've run into that many times with people at high levels, even chief scientists in different organizations. They refused to believe it, but it was not based on logic. It was based on something they probably been trained as a children not to believe in, with their backgrounds. So I don't know. There's several possibilities. But whatever the case, that's what brought me to DIA, because when that happened, I get a call from DIA before too long, from Jack Lavona at DIA, and said, because he was following the work and really supportive of it. And he said, well, since you no longer have all that activity related to remote viewing, just come on down to DIA. We have a position open and you'll fit right into it. And it was a perfect fit because it was right into the same slot. Basically had that FTD on another level. And now I'm now working in the same project basically with, and we struck up liaison with Skip Atwater and others when I moved down there to DIA in 1980. And continued on almost as if nothing had happened. My location from Wright-Patterson to DIA. So I'm there then in 1980, and then I continued the liaison work. I continued with SRI coordination and contract work and other things. And then ultimately the Army set up the Fort Meade unit, the remote viewing unit at Fort Meade, which began to run officially around 1979, late 1979. And they bowed out for some reason, again politically, from what I understand, about 1984, and the DIA stepped in. And I wrote all the justification material and the material for creating new positions in DIA, had that approved by Congress, and I had the Fort Meade unit people remain where they are, but now they're working for DIA because they have bills that have been approved by Congress. They're not in the Army, even though they are Army people. DIA employs about a 50% military to civilian ratio in the workforce. So here I am now in 1985, 86, having completed that little chore. And then a little later, when we received some funding from research sources, not just analytical or operational funding sources, we could now be more diverse in the research that we were encouraging or setting up or trying to get rolling through through SRI. So at that point, I was moved up to Fort Meade in 1990, and I stayed there till about 1993 when the opportunity to leave early and resume teaching and writing. It was more attractive to me, so I then left. So that was how I got there.
Oh, wow. So how long did you actually run the remote viewing program when you were in the DIA?
Well, other than my role in coordinating and being involved in an interagency task force that was set up by Dr. Verona, and I was the chief component there, setting up and identifying and going for or looking for projects that would be suitable for us. That was a fairly intensive role, although I was not physically at Fort Meade. I interacted with them almost regularly on a daily basis. But I physically wasn't moved. I didn't move into the position. I didn't change my physical office space until 1990. So I was then there for those 3 years. And that's when we had to change the code words. Prior to this, the Army had identified several project names. Some of them were special access, some of them were just special control, but not special access. And this is where the names Center Lane and Grill Flame and Sun Street come up, because those were code words that were used by the Army, and we just sort of kept them when we had them transition from the Army personnel to the DIA personnel rosters. So when I moved up there, I changed code words, which we did usually every 3 years anyway for special access. I came up with I created the name Stargate because I didn't like the words that were in the recommended code word books that special access programs. I'm talking about security program, and not just a special security organization does this, and they had these code words for these kinds of classified programs where you had a strict need to know, and you had to control who knew what and where. So I came up with the name Stargate because I thought it was better than these awful words that were available in the printout. But I had to get it approved through the Undersecretary of Defense, which I did. Wrote a memo explaining why I wanted to use the word Stargate for this activity. And my rationale was, we're looking at something that's beyond the ordinary of a collection or an intelligence project. We're looking at something which is we're advancing the potential. We're looking at advancing human potential. So I'm looking at it from that point of view. And of course, the star aspect is kind of a neat symbol, and the gate is always interesting. Opening the gate, like in remote viewing, we have the term aperture. You open the aperture; it's pretty much the same thing. So it got approved, so that's how the word Stargate came into the reality. Because now later, in 1995, when our commander and other reasons transferred the thing, the activity to the CIA, and the CIA didn't want it from the very beginning, and they set up this group that was definitely going not to approve it or to give it a good rating, and they recommended closing it. And so this is like in 1995, so the CIA is involved about half a year. And they take all the files and they pump the name CIA files on it. And now people think that this is all CIA's work, which is fine. Let them take the heat. but in the CIA, what's marked as CIA files are really 99% Department of Defense documents, either directly or from funded sources or from contractual work that was supported by them, DIA and DOD in general, not just the DIA, but half a dozen to a dozen other agencies within the DOD that we were able to bring together to provide funding, including DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Project Agency. They chipped in too. So we had all these different funding sources come in. So there's a DIA and DOD produced material is in the CIA files, and that's what's floating around right now. And the name Stargate seems to be associated with it more than anything else, even though there are other names that people like to use, and they should be using them because it's part of the history. of the entire effort. But so that's kind of where I ended up, and I'm bringing it in. I end up taking it out with the name Stargate.
So one of the things that I find really interesting as we close out tonight, and is that there's a lot of naysayers still to this day out there that claim that all of these really high quality scientists like yourself were not actually of your sound mind. Like, oh, you guys didn't know, you didn't do real research. It was all made up. And there's some people even that had some aspects of doing research in the past that claim that they did research, and that when the Stargate program and things were under you and others, that you guys didn't look at the research. And so you guys didn't follow the protocols and things of that nature. So, I mean, it's just so much muck out there. But here I have you now, one of the men that was really behind a lot of this stuff, surviving and thriving and moving on. Is this real? Is it fake? Is it real? Like what's the truth here? You know, and is there any science that backs this up, or is it all just, you know, made up? You guys were all like stealing from the MK Ultra batch of, you know, of stuff that they had left over, and, you know, on your break time, and not really of sound mind. What's the truth here?
Well, yeah, this mixed stuff here. There were things that did happen within the Fort Meade group that could have been improved in the very beginning, and we were strived to improve them in terms of tightening up the protocol. But that doesn't answer the question of the phenomenon being real. Okay, that was just simply cosmetic, so to speak. And ultimately, we did straighten that out. We got the good protocol in that we needed. Not that it wasn't that bad, but we couldn't, you know, go in front of a court of law and say this is absolutely foolproof. You know, there might have always been something that wasn't kept track of properly and all that. So that's cosmetics, but that's not the phenomenon. Now the phenomenon, you know, I have to look at it a little differently from the operational side, because in operations it's really hard to do science, pure science, and from the point of view of, do you have a homogeneous database that you're evaluating? Was everything done perfectly? Was just done within every little step that needs to be done in a scientific experiment? And sometimes it's not. Sometimes you get what's called too much information up front. And you don't want it, but it happens inadvertently. Remote viewers that work for detectives understand that work very well, how to keep too much information out, particularly if something gets into the papers and you can't not help but read that. That might influence the session that you're doing that night. So yeah, there are all these issues. So you can't use the operational world to make a judgment about the reality of the phenomenon. You have to go elsewhere for that. If you really want to look at it scientifically, then you have to go elsewhere. And that is the laboratory. And then the laboratory has this downside too, because you need lots of numbers. Now, who can sit and do 100 experiments in a row, or you know, maybe not every day, but you know, you need statistics and you need numbers. So you have issues that come up there as well that diminish the strength of the statistical strength of the experiment. So you plug along, you're trying to do that. So that's better, but it's still a problem. But the best way to do it is the way I've done it myself personally, is to do my own work. I trust myself. I've been there long enough. I know I'm not going to fool myself. And I set up my own experiments with proper observation and other records. And then just work with people and see what happens over time with a consistent type of protocol that you can rely on, you know, and timings and schedules and people that are willing to do this. You don't want to just pull anybody in off the streets and do it like maybe they did in the Rhine group early on. But when you find a few people and you work long term, and everything's tight and documented, and now with the internet, It's so much easier than it was before, when the records and the communication are so difficult to control and say there's no leakage. Now you can prove that what came first and what came second, and the whole sequence is there, documented. This is what science wants to know. How tight was the experiment? And now we have the ability to do that with the internet connectivity and the timing on it. So I've gone this route, and I've done some work recently in the past 5 years, and working with precognitive data that has really been quite impressive. I'm not talking about me personally. I'm talking about what we did in terms of precognitive work. And for me, that really does it. I've actually seen it. I've gone through that. I've done the evaluating. I've had others do the evaluating, and we come out on top and say, this really does demonstrate the phenomenon. It still may not convince the diehard skeptic. So, but we're making progress from the experimental, from the citizen science approach, which is what I'm taking on myself right now, more or less, and also from the operational world. You just have to be careful how you judge that operational stuff, and it's there. It's real. But the different ways of its weight and who will be looking at it, and for what purpose will they be looking at it.
So are you saying that it was valid when you guys were doing it in the military and in the government, or was it not a real phenomenon when you guys were doing it?
Oh no, I've never said it's not a real phenomenon. I understood that before I became involved. Either through experiences or through my own readings of it, and then experiments with local people to convince myself that there really is something here, that is a phenomenon. So I carried that understanding along with me into the work I did. But I remain somewhat as a careful, I don't want to say skeptic, but I remain careful as if I were a skeptic. What would I need to know or see in order to actually believe this material? So, for me, no, I'm there. I believe. I don't use the word believe. I accept it as real. It's a fact. It's not a belief anymore. It's an experience that happens. Belief is gravity a belief?
It's good to hear you say it because, again, like I said, there are people who doubt that Stargate was and the programs, before it that were named, well, the same program, but just different names before it, was not real. And that's why they shut it down. And, the CIA, shut it down. And so people hang on that and say, well, it wasn't real. And when you talk to people like yourself who've been there, there's never a doubt. Everybody involved is like, yes, this is a real thing. Do we have 100% understanding of it? No, but it's real. It doesn't validate or invalidate the fact that it is a real phenomenon, that we can do this. Human beings can do this and have and did for the government for 20 years.
Yes, correct. Yeah. I'll be a defender all the time.
Do you think it's still a program going on somewhere in the government?
Well, I don't think there's a formal program. I think the publicity and the possibility of publicity, if any agency were to stir things up again, is too much for the management to overcome. I think, if anything, there's interest on the side. They may have identified a group or an individual or two that they might pull in from time to time. But I don't think there is a dedicated group set aside somewhere. First, there will be a real management problem, and that's one of the things we were running into toward the end of the program, or the effort, was where do we really belong? Because we're doing more than just technical intelligence. We're doing work that relates to homeland security. We're doing work that might be more customs related, in finding fugitives, which is not part of the DOD, or not part of the DIA's requirements or responsibilities. So the question, who should really pay these people where should they be housed? We ran into that toward the latter part of the program. And in fact, I had with some of my colleagues and people on the group made numerous visits to different locations in the area, in the DC area, where it might be better located. So, do we want to be more available to the Homeland Security, or do we want to be more available to this group or that group? And certainly intelligence is important, but so does it matter where should we be? And that was an issue. But if you limit the focus, then I think a certain group might only work on a certain type of thing for Homeland Security, for example, or drug trafficking. They wouldn't necessarily overlap or even be used or even be aware of in the intelligence community. So I think these little pockets like that may exist. But in terms of a consolidated effort that would span multi-organizations, no, I don't think that's in the cards for some time. I think the smoke has to clear, and before that will happen. Maybe 50 years from now, there'll be somebody looking at this discussion we're having here and break out in laughter. These guys didn't know what they're talking about. Here we are. We've been doing this now for the past 30 years. I hope they give us some credit for it. So, but anyway, I think, no, I don't think there's a dedicated group anywhere. People might be brought in. And actually, I think as the topic becomes more familiar to people and more people realize this really is a talent that can be developed or a capability that can be uncovered, then within any particular organization, there will be that individual that finds with a little practice and maybe coming to Psi Games in August, we'll stir things up with people and go back to their home organization and say, well, maybe we ought to think about this a little bit. And maybe if you have a pressing problem, maybe I or somebody else in your organization, we can use them and do a little bit of training or practice and see if we can work on that. So something like that might develop. In fact, I'm not at all surprised if it will. So, and groups like what we do in IRBA and what the IASD, the Dream, and all these others, a lot of groups, not just the ones that we're more familiar with. And more, this visibility occurs. The naysayers are going to be left in the dust. We'll just kind of chuckle at them and say, well, you don't know what you're missing, no matter what you think of us. We're here and we're doing what we can and enjoying life and having fun doing it. And once in a while playing games.
Tyler, any questions on our way out?
No, yeah, I think you hit on it with the continuation of the remote viewing program. I was interested in that as well. I think the things like the telepathy tapes. So there's the whole research side of ESP inside, but I think now we're seeing very well put together marketing and promotion of the research and studies that are done. So I think that aspect, and Psi Games is right in that handful of different things that I think are going to help the promotion and acceptance and the widespread, kind of just exploration into these topics. So thanks again, Dale. Appreciate it.
I want to mention one more thing. I wanted to bring it in earlier. I'm glad you brought me back to the topic. I'm the vice president of IRBA, and also I'm on the IRBA's remote viewing unit, the IRU. Research unit, the IRU. And about 6 months ago, we wrote a proposal for a group in Portugal, the BIAL, the BIAL group that has funding for research. And we were awarded a substantial research fund for doing research. And we'll be promoting that and explaining what we'll be doing in the next 2 years for this project, for this bio research project that we won in IRBA and the IRBA IRU group. So that's another avenue on which we can explain or demonstrate how we can do this research, and we don't need to be in a academic research laboratory in order to gain that recognition. That if we have the right approach and write it professionally and the right the proper and people that are recognized in the community to help us out, which we are doing, then we can proceed and do this research. And then what we're looking at then is associations, links between remote viewing and AI and evaluating the data and looking at the differences between remote viewing and dream data. So we're looking at these kinds of differential effects. And I think that will also pique interest, because we're not looking at just one piece of the phenomenon. We're looking at a spectrum of things that we can do. So I'm all for a multi-integrated approach, and I think you are also. So I'm happy to see that. Happy to see that.
Well, Dale, thank you so much. This was a great conversation, hearing your history, hearing your experience, how you got into Psi, how you started with the Foreign Technologies Division, moved over to the DIA and doing great work there. All of the stuff that you're doing with lucid dreaming and dream yoga and beyond. And I just really applaud you and appreciate everything. And we are so grateful to have you at the Psi Games this year in August 1st through the 3rd in Charlottesville, Virginia. And yeah, that's all I have to say. Tyler, thank you so much for being here with us today. I'll let you say what your piece is before we go out for tonight.
Oh, no, thank you, Dale. Appreciate the time. That's actually really cool to hear about IRBA. So I'm interested to see and love the community collaboration as well with researchers and think that's much needed. So looking forward to all that. And thanks again, Hakeem, for having me. Another great episode.
Yep. Thank you, guys. And until next time, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this. Share it with your friends. And we'll see you at the Psi Games 2025 in Charlottesville, Virginia, August 1st through the 3rd.
Okay, to be there.
Step into the beyond, let your mind ignite, where the limits dissolve in the glow of the light. A world unseen, we will rise to explore, unlocking the depths of our universal core.